Hello and welcome everyone to this year's Graphic Novel Day. Welcome to the first reading with Sarah Mirk and Andreas Schüller. I'm more than happy to see you all, and I'm even happier that this year all the authors we invited could actually make it to Berlin. Because as you might remember, last year we had to cancel half of the events at the last minute. This year this is not happening, everyone is here. We're going to have a great time, and I'm especially happy that Sarah could fly here from the US. Sarah, welcome to Berlin.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here, thank you.
Now, today we're going to talk about Sarah's book, Guantanamo Voices, which you can see here. This event is happening in cooperation with the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights. The ECCHR is an independent, non-profit, legal and educational organization. They're dedicated to enforcing civil and human rights worldwide, and they have been doing so since 2007. You might have heard of them because they were instrumental in bringing about the first criminal trial worldwide on state torture in Syria before a German court. And Andreas actually mentioned to me in the run-up to this event that this is probably the most fitting day to talk about Guantanamo because, as you might know, today is the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and just as much as the Twin Towers have become a symbol of the pain and grief visited on the American people through these terrorist attacks, Guantanamo as a space, as a place, has become a symbol for the pain and grief and injustice visited on a lot of other nations by the US in retaliation through their war on terror. So this is definitely, it's a very difficult conversation we're going to have. It's also painful, but it's definitely a conversation that we need to have, and I'm very happy to discuss this topic with Sarah and Andreas today. Now, Sarah Mirk is a graphic journalist, editor, and teacher. Her work has been featured in The Nib, The New Yorker, and NPR, among others. She has a background in journalism, covering political issues, and has worked as an editor for Bitch Media and The Nib, and as a digital engagement producer for Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting. She has published a number of books with very good titles, I think. One of them is Sex from Scratch, Making Your Own Relationship Rules. And another one is a graphic novel, Open Earth, about a woman's adventure in love and sex aboard an orbiting space station. Andreas he directs the International Crimes and Accountability Program at the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights. He holds a Master of Laws from Leiden University in Public International Law and International Criminal Law, and has worked in the past or continues to work on US torture and drone strikes, UK torture in Iraq, and war crimes in Sri Lanka, on Syria. So he's going to give us a little bit of legal background on this topic. Now, Guantanamo Voices has a very fitting subtitle, True Accounts from the World's Most Infamous Prison. It's a very interesting format because it's an illustrated oral history. It's basically interviews with detainees and service members and social workers at Guantanamo about their experiences. As you all know, this prison opened in 2002. It has been running for a long time, so long that we almost maybe forget that it still exists. And I already told you, Sarah, when I read this book, I actually had to stop twice because I had to cry. I mean, the injustice of it is just so palpable in these comics. That made me wonder, first of all, how you started working on this topic.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll talk about it in my time.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay?
Yeah, okay, so you have brought a few images or a little presentation to show us how you created this book, and you will take us through that now.
Yeah, I'll stand up because it's more comfortable, if that's okay. Oh, thank you so much. It's okay. Thank you. Thanks to everyone for being here. I really am honored to have you come and listen to me. So I'm going to talk for about half an hour, and then Andreas and I will talk with Lilian. So I'll just get started. This is the book. It's called Guantanamo Voices, and it's 10 different stories from the prison told through 10 different artists. So I talked to people who had spent time at the prison in different capacities, including former prisoners, service members, lawyers, and hopefully together their stories paint a picture of the reality of the prison. So I start out the book with this quote from the Constitution and also from the Geneva Conventions, because I think they're good to keep in mind as you learn about the story of the prison. And so I'll start out the talk with them too. The things to note here are that, like, a foundational part of the Constitution is that you have the right to a speedy trial in the United States, and that under the Geneva Conventions, people who are prisoners of war shouldn't be held for more than 3 months. So when I read that, I just keep that 3 months in mind, because we're now 20 years on. So today is the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and in America we say on 9/11 we all said we should never forget. So today I want us to remember and talk about memory. And how on 9/11 we said we should never forget, we should always remember this, but very, very quickly the government started to politicize that memory, to help control the narrative of what was remembered and what was forgotten, and who was forgotten. We immediately started building prisons where we would hide people to forget about them. We immediately started a campaign of torture that was legalized by the government. And we immediately started to say that there were foundational laws of our country that we didn't need to follow anymore. So, a lot of ways, the story of Guantanamo feels really complicated. And, as a journalist, I was approaching this thinking, like, how am I ever going to tell this story? It's so complex. It's been going on for 20 years, hundreds of people involved, lots of legal issues. But in a lot of ways, that complexity is by design. Because if you have a prison that's really hard to understand and hard to explain, full of complicated legal issues, it can help obscure the truth, which is that the United States has imprisoned hundreds of Muslim men from around the world without trial for years, and we continue to do so. So once I realized, actually, this is a pretty simple story to tell. How do you get that message across? This is not the story that our government is telling. So I'm going to walk through 4 different ways that our government tries to control the narrative around Guantanamo, tries to control the story that we tell about the prison to ourselves, and then 4 ways that I hope that comics can help counter that story, that comics can be used to undermine that narrative and make a new, more honest narrative. So the first tactic that the government uses to try and control the narrative about this place is design. So all prisons in the United States are designed to be invisible. They're mostly in rural areas and behind, large walls or fences with very limited public access. So whether you're a regular person or a journalist, it's hard to visit a prison. And there's no prison where that's more true than Guantanamo Bay, which is located on a U.S. military base that we occupy on the southern side of the country of Cuba. This is a screenshot from Google Maps, and they very helpfully note that the prison is still open on the map. I thought that was interesting. I was like, oh yeah, it's open for business. And even on the base, it's a U.S. military base, so there's thousands of people that live there and work jobs. But even on the base, the prison is removed so that most people on the base can't go to it. And you have to have special clearance in order to go. Access for journalists is also tightly controlled. If you're a journalist, you're not allowed to interview anybody who is incarcerated in the prison. And you can go there on a trip. Like I went on a military-sponsored trip to the prison as a journalist to cover it, but your access is really controlled. You're led around by PR people, basically, who work for the military, who say, this is what you can take photos of, this is what you can't take photos of, we're going to see this thing and not this thing. So it's not public access. And on the base, it feels just like a regular American town. They have a McDonald's. They even have a gift shop where you can buy memorabilia from the base. So They have like Disney-branded merchandise, which how we got to this point in history is alarming. And then, like when I was there, they were hosting, events to boost the morale of the thousands of people that work on the base and live there. It's just like any small American town, but with like the world's most infamous prison over the hill. And so one of the events that they were hosting when I was there was an escape room for people that work on base. And totally unironically, just at the library. So this is what the outside of the prison looks like. This is the way, because of this design, because it's in such a remote place and access is so limited, that means that our visual understanding of this place is really censored and controlled, and therefore it can be set by the military. So I always think about what stories do different visuals tell. I'm a cartoonist, so I'm always thinking about like, what's the story that this picture is telling? And if you think about Guantanamo, the picture that probably comes to mind, it looks something like this. So I just Google image searched Guantanamo. This is what comes up. It's mostly photos that were taken by the military of detainees, and it's like you can't really see who they are or what they're like. The second image here is actually from a fictional movie about Guantanamo, not even the actual place, and then protests that are happening outside the prison, like in the United States and around the world. So like from this, you don't get a real feeling of like, okay, well, this is a real place full of real people who have real lives, because we don't get to see who they are. For many, many years, if there was any pictures available of the people in the prison at all, it was basically like their mugshots taken by the government. So this is a former detainee named Abdul Latif Nasser. We don't have photos of them reading books or hanging out with their families or eating dinner or being a human. We just have these mugshots, basically. So that's really dehumanizing in a lot of ways. This is definitely the most famous photo taken at Guantanamo, and this is what I always thought of as Guantanamo whenever I happened to think about it before I started reporting on it. So this is a photo that was taken by a member of the U.S. Navy. So it went through the military channels to be released. This was in 2002. And then it was released to the world. So, like, what does this picture say? What you see here are like, you can't see people's faces. You can't see if they're like laughing or crying or shouting, or you can't see their eyes. You can't connect with them. So this is one of the pictures that the U.S. government released to the world to help try and shape that visual narrative understanding of the prison. And that's what I want to talk about next. The next step of setting that narrative is dehumanizing the people who are really at the center of it. So looking at this photo again, this was taken on one of the first days that the prison was open in 2002. And so the US government, why would they release this picture? What would they want us to think by seeing this? I just want you to think about that. And then why did they think like this is the image that we want to present to the world? Since then, since 2002 when this picture was taken, the prison's been open for almost 20 years now, and there's been about 780 men who have passed through there, and 39 are still there today. So, and since 9/11, how many trials have started for 9/11 crimes? 0. So, all we knew at the time was basically what the government told us about those people who we saw in that photo. And this is from a speech that George W. Bush, who was the president at the time, gave that same month that the prison was opened. So he said, here's who's in that prison. It's people who are terrorists, who were once occupied Afghanistan, are now in cells at Guantanamo Bay. So this was immediately the narrative that the government was setting, was we did a good job, we caught the bad guys, we put them in this prison, here's a photo. Here's the other things that were said about them at the time that helped shape that narrative, that they were the worst of the worst terrorists in the world, people who want to kill Americans. Somebody who was high up in the Bush administration at that time actually said that the people who are in Guantanamo are so dangerous that they would chew through the hydraulics cable of an airplane to bring it down. And when you paint people like that, that's dehumanizing them. That's saying they're not humans like you and I am. There's something different. In this case, literally saying they're like a savage beast, they're evil. And if you say that somebody's not human like you and I are, that helps justify not treating them the way we would other humans, not following the laws that we would follow for anyone else to incarcerate them. So that's basically what I thought about Guantanamo until 2008 when I met this person, whose name is Chris Arendt. And Chris was making a zine. I make zines, like little comics. And I happened to be making a zine right next to them. And I was like, what are you working on? What's that? And they said, oh, it's a zine about my time as a prison guard at Guantanamo Bay. And I was like, what? They were like young 20s, lots of tattoos and a mohawk. And I was like, wow, you were a prison guard at Guantanamo Bay. And they told me all about it. And they joined this group after they were deployed called Iraq Veterans Against the War and started becoming more political and protesting against the prison. And through being involved in that, they were invited on a speaking tour around England with former Guantanamo prisoners. And so I said, you're telling me there's going to be like a minivan with a former Guantanamo guard and former Guantanamo prisoners driving around England for a month doing a speaking tour? That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard of. Like, can I come and document it with you? And so I did. I got to go with them. They all said yes. So this is in January 2009, so right when Obama was being inaugurated. And he had promised to close the prison, so it was a very exciting time of a lot of change and conversation. But through that, I met people who had been incarcerated in Guantanamo. It was the first time that I actually met people who weren't just that photo of people with masks and eye coverings, but actual humans. These are two people who are former prisoners who are working with that group of former prisoners who are organizing the tour. And I was so surprised to meet them and find out that they were smart and funny and had families and stories to tell and were real, living, breathing people. And since then, I really wanted to help change the story that we tell about Guantanamo in the United States and say, how can we tell a story that feels more accurate to these experiences and is not just what the government is telling us? And I immediately thought that the way to do that was comics. So this was almost 12 years ago now. And I started a blog about the trip where I took a lot of photos and wrote a lot of text, but I really saw it as being it should be a bigger story that's told through comics. And I kept a sketchbook at the time of the trip and immediately started drawing, here's what a graphic novel about this could look like. My drawing's gotten a little bit better over the last 10 years, hopefully. But the reason I saw it as immediately a comic was because there was so much visual strength to this story. And because I think that comics have a really unique power in this world. And that power is to help make the invisible visible. So with comics, you can travel through space and time. You can go to places in comics that it's very difficult or impossible to go to in real life, whether that's outer space or, Guantanamo Bay prison. And so I thought that comics are a good way to get around the censorship that the government had around allowing access to that prison. And the first comics project I did about Guantanamo was a few years afterwards, after that trip. A woman who had also worked at Guantanamo approached me and said, I was at Guantanamo, I really don't know how to process my time there. I feel really conflicted about it. I feel like I was part of something bad, and I don't know what to do with these feelings. So she and I together, I interviewed her and made a comic about her experiences. Her name is Laura Sandow. And then she and I together interviewed another woman who had been deployed there and made a comic together about her experiences. And with these comics, it was so powerful because you could say, okay, I don't have to have photos of these things that happened. I don't have to have a film crew that can go and get these images of what happened. You can tell me a story and I can capture that reality that you experienced really 30 years ago, 20 years ago. It doesn't matter when it happened. We can show that in comics. And that it can be something that I think is really emotionally resonant with the readers. You can help show someone's emotional reality in a comic. And in this case, I wasn't sure what Guantanamo actually looked like, so I had her just describe really thoroughly, here's all the details of the place, here's what it looked like, here's what my desk was like, here's what I would have been wearing. And through hearing those details, we could draw, here's what this place looks like. And I think my goal with this is really just to make people understand that this is a real place full of real people, not a place we should forget about. And so that's another way that our government tries to control this narrative, is through disguise. So in 2017, I had been thinking about this project for a long time, and then Trump said he was going to keep the prison open and potentially even send more people there. And so I said, this is something I really have to write about this. I have to get this book done that I've been thinking about for the last 10 years. And so I got the chance to go to Guantanamo and actually take pictures and start reporting there. And the thing that you know about Guantanamo is that the United States doesn't call it a prison. They say it's a detention camp or a detention facility. And the use of their language is one way that they really try and disguise what this is. There's all kinds of examples of this at Guantanamo. So it's not a prison, it's a detention facility. These aren't prisoners of war who are kept there. They're a new category that we made up called enemy combatants. So even in the language that we use to describe this place, it's disguised. And that's how our government tries to set the story that we're telling ourselves. And what's cool about comics for telling the story is that they really can express your personal perspective. And in traditional journalism, there's this idea that the author is removed from what they're writing. You're sort of like a robot who's just reporting the facts, ma'am. And in comics, it's not that tradition at all. Instead, you see the hand of the person that drew the comic in it. So you feel like, yes, a person made this. And there's a lot more of a tradition with comics journalism of putting yourself as the author into the story. And I think that helps both address your biases and your background and your perspective that you're bringing to it, but it also makes it possible for you to kind of challenge the story that's being told. So there's this really nice moment in Guantanamo Voices where I could depict talking to the person who was the PR guy leading the tour about these language choices. And you could see my conflict as a reporter saying, so, can we take photos at this prison? And him saying, it's not a prison. And instead of having to either just present the government's language, because that's seen as objective and that's the accurate truth, or just present my language, you can see this back and forth here and how I settled on what to call it. And I really love the way that comics journalism can put the author in the story, and then also that you can see that this is a comic that's made by people. It's very clear that this was drawn by a person, it was lettered by a person, it was colored by a person, and all of what we might be bringing to it as our perspectives. And that's another way I tried to embody kind of challenging that government idea was in the cover of the book. So the cover of the book is based on this postcard that I bought at the Guantanamo Bay gift shop, which I just thought this really embodied the visual idea of what the government is trying to sell at the prison. It's a beautiful place, great beaches, everything's fine, And so I use this as the basis for the cover, which is drawn by a beautiful artist named Maria Nguyen, to say, hey, take this postcard, and then I want it to be this vision, and then it's undermined by these really surreal and violent scenes if you look a little bit closer. I want to be okay, we've taken the government's visual narrative here, and we're challenging it, we're subverting it by having these inset images that are a jarring contrast to that postcard image. So when I was at Guantanamo, what I was doing there was taking a lot of photos of stuff that could be details in the comic. What I wanted to make it feel was really okay, if you're reading this comic, you know that this is like an actual place where people work, where people live, that's a place we should know about. So anything that feels all the details that you don't see all the time. This is a bus transfer. Details of the uniforms that people are wearing. Is there reporters getting off the plane? The whole time I'm thinking, okay, we're going to have these kind of details to draw them accurately. Things like the uniforms that people are wearing are important to get accurate and correct so that it feels really real to people. And also because those small details can make a big difference. Like they have some symbolic meaning. Every patch and stripe that someone's wearing has a visual symbolic meaning to it. Sorry. We can only see these two photos. Okay, yeah, and then just trying to document some of the daily life on the base. So there's thousands of people that work there, and they do things like go on trail runs and make their own signs. And they do things like, maybe we'll see the next one. Well, you can just admire this trail running sign. Oh, there we go. They do things like drink coffee, which I just showed you a picture of. And then this is actually a picture of inside the prison where we were able to go into like an empty wing of the prison, basically, and take photos in there. So this is a cell that's been turned into a very small library. Oh, that's the coffee I was going to show you. I like that there are two kinds of coffee you can get on base. One is called Valor Blend, and one is called Jamaican Me Crazy. And because we're not allowed to talk to any of the prisoners, I was trying to capture any kind of humanity from them that I could. So what books are they reading? How can we kind of like work in what they're interested in? Then from there, I took the interviews that I did and those experiences on base and wrote a script for the comic. The scripts look just like a movie script where you say, panel 1, here's what happens. And this is all footnoted, and then I hired a fact checker as well, another journalist, to go through and fact check it. And then we go through many rounds of editing on the text before the artists start drawing. And then I've developed this color palette for all the artists to use. Because it's 10 different stories, I wanted it to feel visually consistent by having the same colors throughout. So we developed a color palette that I call a sunset tones color palette that I thought would draw people in, to make it accessible. And then all the artists went to work. So this is the first page of the book, drawn by Hazel Newlevant, and they did their thumbnails here, and then they moved on to the pencils. So it's a little bit more formal. Then the first layer of colors, and then that's like basically the final draft. And you can see how the pictures that I took wound up becoming the basis for these pages. So I give all the pictures that I took and all the photo evidence I have. And then the artists take that and interpret it in their own way. So artists do have some sort of creative freedom and liberties with what they're drawing, but because it's journalism, there are details that we're trying to get accurate, such as here's what the sign looks like, here's what uniforms look like, here's what the plane looks like. Those kinds of details we're trying to get accurate, even if the colors, for example, are totally out of this world. And that's another of the most powerful things about comics as a medium, is that they can capture this emotional reality. And in that way, I really feel like comics create empathy, because you're seeing a person on the page, you're seeing what they're wearing, you're seeing what they're experiencing, you're seeing where they live and what they're eating, and you can create this kind of emotional tone through the page. And I'll just show you a few examples from the book of work that different artists did. So here's one by Maki Naro about the lawyer Thomas Wilner, and you can see he's able to tell a story here from Thomas Wilner's perspective that creates this really powerful, emotional scene where he's at a cocktail party thinking about the prison. Here's a page by Omar Khoury that's the story of Mozambique, who, in this page, he's kidnapped from his home by American forces. And I knew I wanted Omar to do this story because his style is so emotionally raw. I feel like his drawings have this roughness to them that I felt would be a good match for this really violent story. And then this is a page by Tracy Chawan, who has a totally different style that I felt like her high contrast kind of line work would help bring out this can feel like a powerful story that pops off the page, even if it's talking about kind of complex legal details. And she also does such a great job with perspective. The artists in the book are from all over the world. So Tracy is Lebanese and now lives in the United States. I tried to get artists from all over the place. Gerardo Alba, whose page is right here, is a Mexican artist who's now living in the United States. And you can see each chapter has a different visual voice, as well as because it's capturing a different voice of a storyteller. And I hope that as people are reading it, they feel like, oh, this is different perspectives on this, and each person is telling their own story. It's not trying to be some kind of objective truth. And here's me on the page. I like how it's drawn by Hazel. One of the most powerful stories in the book that always connects with me is this story of Matt Diaz, drawn by Alex Vegas. This is a story that really resonates the most with me, where Matt was a lawyer who was deployed to Guantanamo, and he was a defense attorney who was actually working for the military there. And at this point, the United States, when he was deployed there, they weren't releasing the names of the people who were in the prison. So we didn't even know, as the public, who was in prison there. And Matt was faced with this decision of like, should I do something about this? I think this is wrong. I think it's against the Constitution. What should I do? And he decided to actually leak the names of the people who were in the prison to a lawyer in the United States. And so he printed off the names, he stuck them in an envelope, and he mailed them out. And he was found out by the military and was actually sent to jail basically for 6 months. He was stripped of his job there, and he was disbarred as a lawyer. So he's one of the few people who has faced any kind of accountability for actions taken at Guantanamo. And his story really resonates with me because it makes me think like, what would I do if I was there? You know, it's easy to, as a citizen on the outside, be critical of the prison, but then if you're in that situation, are you going to take that risk? Is it worth it to you? You know, he paid a heavy price for that. So I hope that that kind of can build empathy between the reader and the people who are there. Oh. Yeah, so the last way that the prison narrative is controlled by the government is through distraction. So most people in this room probably haven't gotten the chance to go to Guantanamo, but here's what it looks like today. So that first scene that I just showed you of kneeling at Camp X-Ray, this is what Camp X-Ray looks like now. It's overgrown. There's no kind of like memorial there. The plans are to tear it down, just raise it. And I really think of that as indicative of how we treat Guantanamo in all of our cultural memory as Americans, is we would rather just tear it down and pretend it was never there than to do any kind of reflection or saying, we should look at this site, we should face this history, even though it's sad and scary and difficult. And so that's part of why, like, most Americans actually oppose closing Guantanamo Bay, and my opinion that it should be closed and that we should have accountability for the people that led the torture campaign there and continue to do so, it's actually not super popular in the United States. This is partly because I think the government's done such a good job of controlling the narrative, of telling, here's the story that we tell and understand about the prison, and it's really hard to counter that. It's hard to challenge that idea once it's in people's minds and it's in part of our whole culture. So actually, since the prison opened, more Americans support torture now than they did 10 years ago. A lot of people say that they think it's useful. And to me, that's really depressing. So I think that what comics, the last thing I'll say about what good comics can do is that they can really help us face these difficult realities. I think that comics can present really complicated and emotionally difficult situations in a way that's accessible and relevant to a wide audience of people. So with the comic, just basically breaking down the basic facts in a way people can understand feels really important to me and really important to countering that government narrative of Guantanamo. Just designing the information in a way that people can actually understand, I think can help us change the culture around understanding this prison. And we can also help understand just exactly what happened here. That while most people are in the prison because the United States actually paid bounties to put them in there, rather than having them be, people that we actually had some evidence on. It's kind of, that story can kind of unfold in a way that people can follow and understand versus not hearing that version at all. The last thing is that comics, I think, can help us connect. They can help us connect to the people who are in them and to each other. So in the book, I have this moment where I have a letter from Abdul Latif Nasser that he wrote to his lawyer, Shelby. And like I said, journalists aren't allowed to interview anybody who's in the prison, but she was able to send him a copy of the book. This is who he is, if you remember. she was able to send him a copy of the book, and he wrote a letter back. And it's a little hard to see, but with his handwriting, but he says that he really enjoyed the book, and he thought that it was a good way to tell their story and about their suffering to the world. So when I got this letter, I just felt really emotional, because our government's tried so hard to keep us apart. So having him read the book and write this was amazing. And then actually he was released from Guantanamo this year, which is a really good sign. So what's next? Well, people always ask this, and I don't have great answers, but I think we need to change the narratives that we're telling about Guantanamo. We need to center the narratives on people who were incarcerated there. These are 3 great memoirs by people who were imprisoned there. We need to listen to their voices instead of just to our government. I think we need accountability. I think we need to look at what crimes people committed and have some kind of process of accountability for that. And I think we need justice. And I don't know what that looks like. So this is one of the lawyers who's working on Guantanamo cases now just said this week, it doesn't look like justice will necessarily come in a courtroom, because we've been trying for 20 years and it's still basically a farce. So I think what we need to do is remember, and hopefully through books like this and other media, we can really remember what we've done. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, for this really interesting talk. I definitely agree with you when you say comics help us face the tough stuff. It did that for me. Your book really made me face things that, of course, maybe I also sometimes would rather forget. Mm-hmm. But we should, of course, never forget. Andreas, I said in the run-up to the presentation that your work includes cases on US torture. Could you tell us a little bit about what the ECCHR is doing in connection to Guantanamo? Are there any cases going on right now? What can you do, being based in Berlin, about this prison on Cuba?
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's difficult to start off with such a great presentation by Sarah to talk about this. About what is justice is a question you kind of ended with. What we tried at ECCHR from basically 2004, 2006 is bringing cases against the architects of the torture program. That's how we call it. So not those who worked in Guantanamo, but basically those who decided to open the prison there, those who decided to torture there, those who decided to put people outside the law there. And so George W. Bush, Don Rumsfeld, George Tenet, the former CIA director, and others. So to bring those in front of courts, to use also the law as probably a way of resistance, also resistance to the government's narratives, as you also perfectly described. We need to resist narratives about Guantanamo, so we as lawyers do it, using the law, as you as journalists use comics to do that. And I think that's important. So what we did is we presented cases, for example, in Germany, as the crime of torture can be prosecuted basically or theoretically everywhere in the world, because there's an absolute prohibition of torture. There's a UN Convention against torture, and there is so-called universal jurisdiction to prosecute torture wherever you find the torturers, basically. So we try to secure evidence here, to build cases. We brought cases in various European countries to an extent that, it's not a surprise that no one was in the dock and that there are no drawings from a courtroom where the architects of the torture are in the dock and facing a prosecution. But we made it a little harder for them. For example, in France, they issued a warrant against the first Guantanamo commander, Geoffrey Miller, to summon him as a suspect to face the accusations against him. There were George W. Bush cancelled a charity trip to Switzerland when we presented a claim there in 2011, and so far none of the architects kind of ever set foot into Europe after they left office and lost immunity. So that's basically a bit in terms of accountability, justice. I don't know. It's a big word. I don't know what if you can count that already going a bit into the direction of justice. But we tried from a European perspective to see what we can do with the law. There are some possibilities to make the life a bit more uncomfortable, to change narratives, basically to say it was torture, it was not enhanced interrogation techniques, it's prohibited, and those are war criminals and torture that should be prosecuted. So that's what we tried to do, knowing that it's almost impossible that you get some of those really in front of a judge at one point in time.
Yeah, you're right. Justice is indeed a very big word, and debates around it often get very heated or very radical in a very short time. Sarah, I was wondering, what feedback did you get on the book in the US when you presented? I mean, you said very clearly that a lot of US citizens still support torture in certain cases, and they don't want to close down Guantanamo. What feedback do you get in general when you present your book?
Definitely the biggest feedback I get is that people just didn't know about Guantanamo. They've probably heard the word before, and they're like, I know it's a prison. There was a Harold and Kumar movie. But not really a lot beyond that. I think, honestly, people in other countries know more about Guantanamo than people in the United States do, because we're such in this, media bubble where we just, a lot of the media outlets, just repeat the government's narrative. So, honestly, the biggest feedback I get is, oh, is that still open? Guantanamo still exists? I thought Obama was going to close it. And then, well, the people who are in there for a reason, right? People often say they're in there for a reason, and that's just the beginning and end of the conversation. The really weird phrase that people use a lot with Guantanamo to justify it, and this is people who I talk to in the book and then just elsewhere out in the world, if I'm just talking about the book or Guantanamo, is a phrase in English where we say, oh, well, to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. And for some reason, people say this all the time about Guantanamo, is oh, to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. And that's always just horrifying to me. I'm like, who are the eggs? And what is this omelet that we're making? It seems very bad. And so I think people rely on those kind of trite phrases because they don't really know what the situation is, If you don't really know that much about a topic, you just tend toward cliches. So that's most of the feedback I get. But people who have read the book have been moved by it and have said, thank you for educating me on this. And yeah, it's been cool. I mostly wrote the book. I was really thinking of my audience as being maybe people who are 17, 18, 19, who Guantanamo has existed their whole lives, and they think of it as normal. And it's really important for me to say, this is a prison that was made by humans during my lifetime, and it can be unmade by humans during my lifetime. So I don't want you to think of it as something that's normal.
Well, and luckily there are a few popular campaigns in the US. You've mentioned a few that are campaigning for Guantanamo to be shut down in the near future. I mean, we're all hoping for that, and of course we are hoping for accountability to be served, for justice to be served at one point. Unfortunately, we're already running out of time. These sessions are always way too short to talk about these really wonderful books. Luckily, Sarah is here, and she's going to stay at the venue after this reading. So if you'd like to ask her more questions, you can find her in the cafe, just to the right over there. And of course, you can buy the book in the bookshop. That's right at the entrance to the venue. You have to leave this bar and go all the way back to where you entered. And there's a bookshop where you'll find Sarah's book, and then she'll be happy to see you in the cafe and talk about it. Thank you very much, Sarah and Andreas, for a very inspiring talk. Next up at 4 p.m. is Vikin Beberian, who will present his beautiful book, The Structure is Rotten, Comrade, on post-Soviet architecture in Yerevan. We're going to take a short break now, 50 minutes, and then I see you here at 4 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you.